Legislation on surprise medical bills is gaining traction in the U.S. Senate. Surprise medical bills. These are those hospital or clinic bills that are typically from out-of-network providers or physicians, typically not chosen by a patient, that a patient might be surprised with after receiving care. It's not a new problem, but it is gaining more attention as these bills can be huge. There's actually new research as well that suggests that 1 in 5 emergency room visits involved an out-of-network physician. So while a patient might have been in-network at their emergency room, that physician working on them might have been considered out-of-network, therefore an out-of-network bill. That's considered a surprise bill, and that's happening more frequently. There are protections in the Affordable Care Act against surprise bills, but many argue they don't go far enough. They cover emergency room care so that if a patient has cost sharing for being in network and they go to an emergency room that might be considered out of network, they will still be billed as if they were in network. So that emergency room care is considered to be in network no matter where it is. The insurers must pay providers at a minimum rate to make this happen, and the kicker, however, is that this does not prohibit these providers from balance billing the patients. So that's one of the pieces of the Affordable Care Act around surprise medical bills that could be improved. While they acknowledge that some emergency room might be out of network and should be treated as in network, there still is this provision for balance billing. So some states have taken matters into their own hands. They have states like Arizona, Missouri, Oregon have passed some legislation or are looking at bills to try to make this a little bit easier on patients. California, Connecticut have gone a little bit further and have included a prohibition against balance billing in their state laws. And then there are other states like Illinois and New York that have binding arbitration processes included in their state rules. Now, there is new bipartisan legislation in the works that would affect the whole country instead of states doing this state by state. It's called the Protecting Patients from Surprise Medical Bills Act. There are 6 senators, bipartisan, both sides of the aisle, working on making sure that there can be protections against surprise medical bills for plans that are state regulated, but also for plans that are federally regulated, for those self-insured plans. And this would be an extension on any of the legislation that we've seen from any of the states to date. The plans themselves, the legislators are looking to limit cost sharing, set a payment standard, and prohibit balance billing. The 3 things that would be, as identified by health policy experts, most important to protect consumers. Now, this bipartisan legislation targets some of the most common surprise billing situations, that out-of-network emergency room care for one, and out-of-network care for ancillary physicians in an in-network facility. So try to chip away at some of those instances where surprise bills happen, most of the time without the consumer even knowing that they had an out-of-network physician working on them. There would be no patient action required in the situations. This wouldn't be one of those situations where the patient wouldn't have to call in advance and give notice. In fact, the providers are the ones that have to give the patients notice. After they've been stabilized, for example, in an emergency room visit, it is now the provider's responsibility to notify the patient of the cost and the ability to transfer to an in-network facility after the emergency care is finished. Where things stand now, determine appropriate payment rates. What would that look like? Now, the Health Affairs blog has suggested some even further steps for the senators to look at. Determine what types of physician bills protection should apply to. Should it be more than just this emergency room and ancillary services? Should it maybe extend to ambulance or air ambulance care as well? So determine the possibility of expanding protections to some of those ambulance services, which can be quite pricey. Now, the purpose of this legislation, according to Senator Cassidy, the draft bill is intended to jumpstart conversations in Congress. There's an acknowledgement now that this has to be something that gets discussed in the U.S. Congress. Patients should have the power, even in emergency situations, they're quoted as saying, when they are unable to negotiate, they should have these protections. Now, where do things stand? The purpose of the legislation is to instruct the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary to conduct a study committee, issue a report with recommendations to Congress, and they should include the impact of this bill on a number of instances: the prevalence of cost sharing, access and quality of care for patients, price of insurance premiums or change, how this might impact emergency room use, how access to new and improved drugs and technology might be impacted, and the adequacy of insurance networks, how that could be impacted by the legislation. So it's new. It's being determined in the Senate right now among bipartisan senators to try to gain more support and to try to set a standard to instruct the Department of Health and Human Services of how to proceed. So it's in the early stages, but it is hitting the key markers of what would be important to increase consumer protections in these situations. You could read that draft bill yourself. You can also read that Health Affairs blog we referenced, where they give even more recommendations than what the senators themselves are looking at right now of what would be adequate for a legislation like this to protect all consumers, not just in state regulated plans, but also in federally regulated plans. You can share your story about surprise medical bills or ask a question or send us an email, and you can do that at healthwatchwisconsin.org.